Hi everybody, and welcome to the lecture material for the first week of Sociology 271, Introduction to the Family. So this week's lecture it's kind of like setting the stage or setting the parameters of what we're going to be talking about in future lectures. So it's pretty conceptual. I'm going to be talking a lot about some of the ideas, the ways that people have thought about families, especially sociologists, the way in sociological theory we've considered families. I'm going to talk about the dimensions along which families differ. And I'm also going to talk about the word family itself. What does it mean? What is our definition of this word, which, as you're going to see, can be used in so many different contexts to mean so many different things. So I hope it's going to be thought-provoking or at least intriguing. And if you've got any questions or anything comes up that's not clear or anything you'd like to say something about, I am totally happy to receive your emails. Before we launch into this, the sort of required stuff, this lecture is the property of me, Amy Kaler, and should not be duplicated, distributed, revised, sold, have anything else done to it without my permission in writing. So with that out of the way, here we go. What is a family? When we talk about families, what are we talking about?
Okay, I'm trying this with testing, 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 testing. So here's where we're going to go with this lecture. First, we're going to talk about that word family itself. I'm not sure if there are any other words, or maybe there are a few other words in the English language that can convey. Here's what we're going to be covering. First, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the word family and the way this word can take on so many different meanings. Family is clearly not just one thing. It can mean a whole lot of different things. I'm going to then take you through a couple of the common definitions of family, how family can be used as a sort of ideological tool, how family is conceptualized and defined by the Canadian Census. And then in the next section, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on a more sociological approach to family, what we would call process definitions of families. I'm going to talk a little bit about dimensions of variation or variability in families, no matter how we define them. And then I'm going to jump with both feet into sociology of family, and we'll talk about some of the different approaches that sociologists have used, theoretical or conceptual approaches to the question of why are families important, why should we study them, and what actually are they. So here we go. So many different ideas and connotations and meanings and values as that word, and we're going to look at a bit at the diversity of the ways in which we use the word family. Okay, to begin with, let's talk about the word family and the work that that word does in the very different contexts in which it's used. Take a look at these sentences. Here's a sort of sampling of sentences that you might hear in everyday speech, people talking about families. I'd like to start a family by the time I'm 30. My family comes from Rajasthan. I'm looking for a family-friendly place for vacation this summer. Just keep it in the family, if you know what I mean. My friends are like family to me, and Canada's immigration policy stresses family reunification. Same word appears in all of those sentences, but it's clearly not doing the same work. If we look at these sentences, just to pull out a few examples, when someone says, I'd like to start a family, or if somebody asks, so when are you planning to start a family? They're usually referring to reproduction, to having children. When are you going to start, start your family, start having kids? So family can be kind of shorthand for producing and living with small human beings. If someone says, my family is from Rajasthan or Latvia or Rocky Mountain House or wherever, they're obviously not talking just about small human beings. They're talking about a lineage, a heritage that it goes backwards into time. So my parents, grandparents, great grandparents, so on and so forth. If you follow this line of people back in time, you'll end up in Rajasthan, Rocky Mountain House, wherever you may be. So, in this sense, family is something that it's a way in which we're connected to past generations and the values and the traditions and the things that were important to them and to places. So, something different in that sentence. Third sentence, when someone says they're looking for a family friendly place to vacation this, we usually know they mean kind of G-rated things for small, tiny humans to do. Not a whole lot of swearing and drinking and loud parties and quote unquote adult behavior. So family is here is standing in for kind of uh, pleasant, quiet, wholesome, happy things that you would want to bring children to. Someone tells you just keep something in the family. It's a bit of a warning or an admonition. Um, and that usually carries the meaning of don't tell this to the whole world. Like, don't share this with outsiders. Keep it in the family may not literally mean the people you consider your family, but it indicates an us and them, a sort of intimate inner circle. We can share this, we can talk about this, but don't talk about it to whoever is the other or the outsider. So a family can be a way of dividing. There's us, and then there's outside. There's everybody else. My friends are like family to me. Um, this is an interesting one because it's usually carries connotations of informality or not having to rely a lot on politeness or extremes of deference to somebody else. If you say they're like family, usually means you can rely on them. You don't always have to be on your best behavior around them, but they are very important to you. So it's another way of conveying that idea of there's a group of people with whom I share certain things and I behave in certain ways, and they are different from the people that are not like family to me, with whom I may interact and behave differently. And finally, there's the really bureaucratic immigration policy stresses family reunification. Under Canadian family law, your family is quite clearly defined if you're interested in immigrating. Your family may be the people that you're uh, born from, your parents, married to, a spouse, the people that you have either have become your children, either through birth or through adoption. And that's pretty much it. People, very close friends that you may have been, you know, interdependent with for a long time, people that are very special to you in other ways. If they don't fit these categories that are defined by officially recognized connections, Canada's family reunification policy is not going to apply to them. So the word family can carry a lot of different meanings. Then we're going to move. Now that we've gotten a taste of the different meanings that family has for people in kind of ordinary conversation, I want to zoom in on three specific ways of defining families. Defining them ideologically, the way the Census, Statistics Canada, defines them, which is going to be important because we're going to be relying on a lot of information from StatsCan in this course, and a sociological approach to families, which looks at processes. So here we go. On to one of the. So the first is the ideological idea of family. And this is an interesting one because this is what we often think about as the traditional family, or maybe even what a real family is. And it's not a notion that has, as you shall see, a whole lot of foundation in actual history or actually the way we live today. But this idea of what a family should be like, or what is the kind of natural or normative or best form of family, is nonetheless quite well entrenched in individual and collective imaginations about. Dora Smith, a Canadian sociologist, called this ideological family. She called it the SNAF, which stands for Standard North American Family, even though it was only the standard for like a really short period of time, which we'll get to later. And this is the idea that the way families used to be at some point in the past, and more important, the way in many ways they ought to be, is an arrangement much like what you see on your screen right now. You've got the male breadwinner. He's there dressed for work. He's kind of interpreting the outside world to his spouse and kids, showing them things in the newspaper. So he's the man of the world. Married to the female homemaker and caregiver. It looks like she's got her apron on and she's about ready to start cooking and baking for everybody. And joint children belonging to both of them. So these are the kids that they had together that are co-residing with them in the home when they're young, and they're all gathered around the table together for a family meal. Probably either dinner, when dad comes back from the office, or breakfast before he heads out. And this ideological family with fairly strict or distinct gender roles, and also with strict or distinct differentiation amongst the generations, parents and kids, and with certain norms governing the way people are connected to each other. Mom and dad are married legally to each other. The children are mom and dad's joint children, and they all reside in the same place. This family form, although it is no longer the predominant family form in Canada, it's still out there, a bit like a ghost. When people talk about alternative families or new family arrangements or anything which sort of sets this up as this is the norm, this is traditional, and then everything else is alternative or non-traditional. So the power of the ideological family to shape the way we think about our own families is pretty strong. Sort of sociology, which is defining our terms. So when you say family, what is it that you mean? And you can look in the dictionary to find a meaning of family, or you can look in the sociological and social science literature. So I'm going to talk about 3 definitions of family: ideological definitions, census definitions, and what we're mainly going to be working with in this course, which is a process definition of family. In the 3rd section, we're going to look at some of the variations in the ways families are structured to give a sense of the incredible diversity and complexity in the way people organize their family lives. And I'm going to introduce some of the most important variables along which families are arranged. And finally, we're going to do a super quick tour of the sort of backgrounds to sociological thought about families that bring us up to the present day in the early 21st century. So here we go. The census family, that is the definition of a family that Statistics Canada uses today when they're counting up families and they're carrying out the census and various surveys, is not, doesn't line up that well with the ideological family or with the SNAF. As of 2017, according to the Government of Canada, a census family family that would count as one family in the census is defined as, and there are many possible permutations and combinations here. A married couple, so you can still be a family even if there are no children, of either and or both spouses. A child that comes with one spouse but not another can still be part of a family. Or a couple living common law and the children, if any, of either or both partners. Or a lone parent of any marriage, single, separated, divorced, widowed, what have you, with at least one child living in the same dwelling, and that child or those children. So we have something that's a lot more flexible and elastic than the SNAF, but still retains some elements that define who is and is not part of a census family. The big one here is co-residence with either an adult partner, whether this is married or a common law couple, or co-residence across generations. So a single adult and a child, or maybe multiple children co-residing. One person living on their own, 4 or 5 people, none of whom are partnered with the others, but they're just all kind of coming together to share a house, are a household, but they don't meet StatsCan's definition of a family. And perhaps most sticky here, separate places who are not sharing the same dwelling. A single parent with 2 kids in Vancouver, and then maybe there's a couple of other kids somewhere else, Calgary, would not be counted as part of the same census family. So families are a subset of households overall, and this definition is much broader than the very conservative one that was taught years ago. But not everybody in Canada is counted in the census being part of a family. Here's an infographic which sums up some of the most important findings from the 2016 census. We're going to be relying a lot on the information that's been released since 2016 from that census. I'm not going to go over this in detail right here and now, but I do recommend that you click pause for a moment or two and just take a look at some of the information here. It will resurface in later lectures, so you'll be encountering a lot of this material again, but take a moment to look at this and see if there's anything here that surprises you or that is different from the way you kind of thought or assumed families were organized in Canada. As I said, I'm not going to go into all the details of the 2016 census findings right now because we'll deal with a lot of those coming up. But I do want to highlight how diverse family change is, both from years ago until now and also across space, how families are always in the process of changing and how they're quite diverse in the way they manifest themselves. So just pulling an example of change over time from census records. This here shows you the percentage of Canadian households that consisted of an adult couple and co-resident children, which is pretty close to the SNAF sort of ideological definition. And you'll see a huge change over time. 1966, vast majority of households conformed to this description. Most recent census, 2016, barely half of Canadian households conformed to this description. I will leave it to you to think about why that might have happened, what might account for this trend, for the rapid decline in the numbers of the proportion of the population that's living as 2 adults and a co-resident child in a home, and we'll learn more about that as we go. Now let's look at an example of change or diversity across places. In the last slide, we looked at change over time in Canadian household composition and the decrease in the proportion of Canadian households that were, adult couple with co-resident children going across time. And here we're looking at variation across place and across geography. So I just pulled out 4 metropolitan areas from across Canada and looked at what proportion of the census households in these cities consisted of that couple with children in living in different places. And as you can see, there's a fair bit of variation. In Edmonton, here we are, 54% of households in the census fell into that category of adult couple with co-resident children. And then we've got Calgary, which is even a little bit higher than Edmonton. And then we go east, and St. John's, New Brunswick, or St. John rather, St. John, New Brunswick, only 44% of households fall into that category of the adult couple with children. We go west, turn around and go the other way, and in BC, less than 1 household in 3 consists of an adult couple with children. And I'd like you to consider for a moment why that might be the case. What kinds of things can you think of that might account for this geographical change or disparity in the proportion of households in the census that fall into the category of adult couple with co-resident children? We can talk more about this in the online discussion portion of the course. So far we've talked about the ideological definition of family as conforming to a certain very specific arrangement of people in a household. We've talked about the somewhat less restrictive census definition of family, who counts as a family in the Canadian census. And now I want to move in a more sociological direction and talk about process definitions of family. And the whole idea behind a process definition of family is pretty simple, that family is something people do. It's not something that you are. It's not a structure or a set of roles or a set of categories that you can kind of drop individuals into. Families are how certain important things in our society happen. And what are these things that happen in families? There are so many things that happen through and by and in families. Identification. Who are you? What is your identity? Who do you, when you consider, like, what is myself? Who am I? Often the process of identification, identifying yourself, leads you back to or leads you through your family, or the people that you consider your family. Intimacy, closeness, under good circumstances, we hope, people are able to find intimacy, whether it's sexual or non-sexual or whatever kind, with other people through the people that they that become part of or are part of their families. Families are also the ways in which we depend on each other. If you're sick and you're in the hospital, who can you count on? Who do you know is going to come and visit you? If you have a child and that child needs looking after and needs help, who are the people that you're going to rely on, depend on to help with that child when you're unable to do so? Who has a claim, going the other way, who's got a claim on your time or your energies or your resources? Who will you help out with money or with material assistance or with, whatever that person needs? Who do you have a claim on? Who has a claim on you? Historically, families have also been where people found protection from some of the negative things around them, some of the dangerous or risky elements of their environment. That was where you might be with the family. You might be safe from dangers posed by external people. You might be safe from hunger or thirst or want or need. You might be safe from being ostracized or being left on your own to try to cope on your own. So, families have been how protection, both physical and emotional and social protection, has been organized. Not everything that happens in families is good, of course, and families have unfortunately been the means through which violence gets perpetrated as well. So you've probably seen some variation on the statement that the most dangerous uh, people to an individual, statistically at least, are members of their own family. You know, if physical aggression is perpetrated against you, it's more likely to be somebody in your family than anybody else. So when we look at a process definition of families, although I think this is the most sociological and this is kind of the best direction to go, we can't pretend that families are all like warm and fuzzy and loving and wonderful all the time, because we know that they're not. This list of how things happen, what things happen through families that I've got here is not meant to be exhaustive. It's not like, okay, here are these 6 things that happen in families and that's the full list. It's meant to give you an idea of family as the way things get done, the how of many important things in our lives, to give you, to kind of get you thinking of families in that direction. Okay, by this point in the lecture, you've probably got the idea that I really put a lot of emphasis on the notion of families as diverse, complex, flexible, variable, and so forth. What I want to do now is take a little bit of time to explore some of the ways in which families can vary, in which the ways in which they can, the organization of families can be very different, one from another, both within cultures and also cross-culturally. So I'm going to be picking up information largely from anthropology, where the studies of family and kinship is probably the most highly developed that it is anywhere in the social sciences. So here we go. And now I want to talk about the idea of family. Okay, now that I think we've disposed with the idea that a family is easily defined or that the word family means just one thing, I want to look briefly at some of the dimensions along which families vary as they've been studied by sociologists and anthropologists. And those of you who've done some anthropology, maybe some structural anthropology or studied kinship systems, may recognize some of this. And there's my cat making her presence known once again. These are not the only ways in which families vary, but I want to get you thinking about the whole concept of variation and the infinite diversity of the way people live in families. So we're going to look at temporal variation, we're going to look at spatial variation, lineal variation, and the concept of extension. The first dimension I want you to think about is temporality, or how families are dispersed across time. Temporality also includes the idea of a family cycle, that there's kind of a beginning and an end to a family as it moves through its life cycle. So when we're thinking about the temporality of families, we'd be thinking temporal variation refers to the way families change over time. As the years go by, families don't look the same way as they did 20 years ago. And I'm not talking about the sort of national level or population level demographics of family. I'm talking about in individual families. Families begin. Everybody might have a different answer for when their family started or began. Sometimes families come to a close, they end, and again, what it means for something to be the end of a family will be individually very different and variable. And we might even think that there's a life cycle for families. You have young families that grow and go through changes and processes and whatnot, and families age, just like individuals within them age, and perhaps there is an end to the family life cycle. They come to a conclusion. So one thing I'd like you to think about, and we can bring this up again in the online discussion, is when, in your experience or your understanding of families, when does a family start? We usually, when we say someone's starting a family, that's usually synonym for having children, but is that really the beginning of all families? Think about whether families ever come to an end. Way back when, in 200 years ago in Europe, a family was said to have reached an end, to be finished, done with, when there were no male heirs left who could carry the family name as their surname. That was the end of the McDonald's or the Stewarts or whatever, when they ran out of male heirs. Is that a concept that still works for you today? Hang on to your thoughts for the online discussion portion on the temporality of families. Think about questions like, when does a family begin? Whoever you consider your family to be, when did this family start? When two people got married, 20, 25, 30, 40 years ago and had their own children? Did your family start 300 years ago? Did your family start 13,000 years ago? What are the time markers for the beginnings and the ends of families? And just like starting, when does a family come to an end? When do we say that family is gone? It no longer exists. Its time has ended. In Victorian times in Europe, in the 19th century in Europe, for instance, a family would, just like families have temporal variations, beginnings, ends, life cycles, whatever those may look like, families also have geographical or spatial variation. So this gets us to the question, where is a family? Is there, the idea of family has been linked with the idea of home, and we tend to think of homes as kind of specific place-based entities. Think of the Canadian census, which works with households and mailing addresses and so forth. Is that the only way we might think about the spatial location of families? Does your family have a place which is the family place? Maybe you have multiple locations. Maybe the spatial dimension of families, where you identify with your family, has shifted and changed over time. Maybe your family is spatially or geographically dispersed across a whole variety of places. Again, something to think about and something to contemplate when we get into some discussion. Be considered to have ended, come to a stop, when there were no male heirs remaining who could kind of carry on the family name. It was the name that was really super important. So if in one generation there were all daughters born who were presumed that they would take the names of other families when they got married, then that family was over, it was ended. In another part of the world, in lineality, or the family line, the family lineage. I'm sure you've heard this term, there's a long line of people in whatever family, or this is your lineage, these are your ancestors, these are your descendants. This is a concept that's often very important when we talk about inheritance. Who's going to inherit from who? Who's going to pass things on to who? So extending back into the past, who are your ancestors, who you inherit from, and forward into the future, who are your heirs, who is going to pick up and carry on from you. In many societies, lineality, identifying your ancestors, identifying the people who are in your line or in your lineage, is really, really super important for a sense of identity, for knowing who you are. In contemporary North America, lineality and lineage is perhaps not as important as it is in other parts of the world, but it's still a live concept. It's still something we think about and talk about. Some societies are matrilineal, which means that the line of lineality goes through the females, the mother and the mother's mother and the mother's mother's mother, and that's primarily how you trace your way back. So a matrilineal society is often one in which if a man marries a woman, he moves into or he joins her lineage, which is defined by her and her mother and her grandmother and her great grandmother and so forth into the past and then into the future. A woman and her daughter's daughter and her daughter's daughter's daughter and so forth down into the future. Patrilineal societies are somewhat more common, and the principle there is male ancestry and male descent. So in a patrilineal society, the central unit is a man, and his lineage, his family's lineage, goes through this man's father, and the father's father, and the father's father's father, and so on, back into history. And then going forward into the future, the lineage, the inheritance, whatever it is, will be passed down from the father to the son, and the son's son, and the son's son's son, and so forth. And in these societies, if a woman marries a man, typically she joins his family, she joins his lineage, and becomes incorporated into a lineage that's defined by its male members. Other societies in practice go more with bilineality, which, as you've probably guessed, is matrilineality and patrilineality. So individuals are connected to their patrilineal ancestors through their fathers, and they're connected to their matrilineal ancestors through their mother. And many families in Canada today are kind of functionally pretty bilineal. People know who their mother's parents were and who their father's parents were, and there's not a sort of a strict hierarchy of importance where either the male line is the most important thing and women are just coming into the family to support the male line, or the female line is the most important thing and men just come into the family to sire the children who will perpetuate the female line. And finally, there's the idea of extension as a dimension of variability in families. You've probably heard of the term. Now, extension has to do with the size of the people you consider family. Who is your family? We often hear people making distinctions between your immediate family and the extended family. And, extended obviously reaches out beyond your immediate family, but how far this extension reaches is really variable from situation to situation and society to society. And ultimately, the extension of your family leads to a point where you make the distinction between these people I'm related to, even if it's in some kind of distant, extended way, and the people beyond here I'm not related to. They are not family, they are non-family. So where do we draw that line? How much does your family extend outwards from the people that are immediately closest to you? It's really variable, from place to place and time to time. The last 150 years in North America and Europe have seen a process of nucleation. And nucleation is the rise in importance of the nuclear family, where parents, spouses, children, siblings are the key family members, and the individual's obligations and connections don't extend really very much beyond that small group of people. This process of nucleation, the move towards a smaller nuclear family, it's occurring all over the world. It's not like a European, North American thing. And a common theme in a lot of family studies from all over the world is the tension between different concepts of family extension, between the idea of family extension that says the nuclear family is what matters and beyond that, not so important, and other ideas about family which say, wait a minute, cousins, uncles, grandparents, second cousins, you have responsibilities to your extended family. You can't turn your back on them. It's an area of tension in a lot of places. It can, at the same time, however, as some sociologists say, yet families have become much more nucleated. You could also make the argument that North American families are becoming more extended, but in a different way, as people increasingly rely on or feel connected to friends or others that they aren't bound to by some kinship, some biological tie or by some legal process. As people talk about chosen families and networks of friends that are who you rely on to help you and to provide companionship and that kind of day-to-day interaction. And you could argue that's a different way of extending the family beyond a few, just two or three people here that are with you to a much wider group. Extended family, there's your immediate family, which might just be a few people that you feel like you're closest to. These might be like parents or a spouse. At the same time as nucleation has been happening around the world, we still see a lot of variability. Here's an example of family extension, and this is drawn from just my own experience. Um, before I went to graduate school, I lived and worked in Zimbabwe for a few years, and the cultural group that I lived amongst was the Shona, and the Shona of Zimbabwe have an understanding of family that was totally different from my North American big city understanding of family. And for them, extended family was a really big network. It was like, through your extended family connections, you were related to all kinds of people that in my own life, my own equivalents, I would have no clue who these people were, like your cousin's brother-in-law's nephew. In Shona society, there's a name for that person, and you have obligations to that person, and you know about them, and they know about you. For me, coming from my own upbringing, I would have no idea who that person was in my life. And the importance of this very wide and complex extended family network showed up even in the language that people used to talk about their families. So part of what I was doing in Zimbabwe was I was teaching English. So one of the really basic vocabulary lessons was family members, like mother, father, brother, son, daughter, and some of those basics. Okay, I could say like, here's the English word and here's the Shona translation. But then once we got outside those few nuclear family words and we got into brothers-in-law and cousins and uncles and so forth, we ran into a language mismatch because there were so many more words available in Shona than there were in English. It's just an example. Here's this chart here. Here's in the column labeled relationship, here's a whole number of people that I might be connected to somehow. A wife's older sister, the wife of the husband's youngest brother, and so forth. And then on the far right column in English, I'd probably render all of these relationships as my sister-in-law. My sister-in-law, my sister-in-law, my sister-in-law, my sister-in-law, my sister-in-law. So they're all connected to me in different ways, but the word that English uses for them is the same. Not so in Shona. For all of these different forms of sister-in-law, there were different and specific words to be used. So you don't confuse your Muramu with your Mainini. Those are two totally different people, even though to me, with my North American lens, they would both fit into the category of sister-in-law. And you don't confuse your Maiguru with your Vatete. Those are, again, very different people with different functions in your life and different significance. So, once I sort of got used to that there was this proliferation of family categories beyond what I was used to, that actually helped me to learn something about the culture and the society that I was in, where family extension was much larger and much more complex than what I'd been used to at home. Across societies and countries and communities in terms of the extended family, the people that you know. Okay, and the last part of this lecture takes us directly into sociology as a discipline, and we're going to consider the ways in which sociologists have conceptualized or thought about families. We're going to take like a little mini tour of the last 150 years of sociology and the study of families within sociology. About that you might. So here's how we're going to go about it. And a lot of these concepts may be familiar to you if you've done courses in history of sociological thought or social theory. We're going to start with functionalism, or structural functionalism as it's often called, which is the kind of the origin of family sociology going way back to the 19th century. Then we're going to look at how Marxism examines the same phenomena as functionalism, but comes to quite different conclusions about what families do and what they are for. Then symbolic interactionism, we're moving into sort of mid-20th century, heavily influenced by psychology. We're looking at, following that, feminist theory, and the kind of the big bang that sort of blew up family sociology by bringing in this idea, this concept that had been, well, we'll get to it, what the big contribution of feminist sociology was. And finally, and ongoing postmodern approaches to families and family sociology. So structuralism or structural functionalism or just plain functionalism was dominant for a really long time. And it derives kind of from the ideas of Emile Durkheim in the 19th century, for those of you that are kind of into theory. And it understands the relationship between families and the societies in which families are embedded as almost a mechanical one, hence this picture of like gears turning each other. So the sort of understanding of the social world held by structural functionalists was very similar to how they might approach like seeing how a machine works with all the different pieces doing their own thing but coming together to produce a functioning machine. So what this meant in terms of families was an emphasis on the idea that within families, individuals have roles. We still hear about roles and, you know, the husband's role, the mother's role, and so on all the time. That's an inheritance from this era. Individuals have their roles, which they play, and their functions, which they undertake. And if everybody fulfills their role correctly, and if everybody carries out their function within the family the way they are supposed to, then the family will be strong and the family as a unit will contribute to the greater society. For people coming out of this tradition, families were mainly important because they prepare individuals who then go on to function in other social institutions, like the workplace, like in education, like within religion. Families kind of prepare and socialize and shape individuals to fulfill roles in organizations and institutions outside the family. Within the family, one of the kind of core ideas in functionalist approaches was that clear divisions between roles and specialization in roles is a good thing. So the SNAF, that ideological family that we talked about, would be kind of appealing to a functionalist because dad has his role and his functions. He is to be the breadwinner and the provider and the sort of final authority. And mom has her specific duties and functions and tasks. She is the emotional one. She is the nurturer and the caregiver. Sons and daughters have their distinct and differentiated roles and specializations. And this is actually a good thing. This is the way families ought to operate. specialization, division of roles was understood for a long time as a good thing. And indeed, there was a lot of concern within early sociology about people who did not adequately fit their roles, were not adjusted well enough to the role that they should be playing, or were not adequately specialized. And you'll see some signs of this in lectures coming up when we talk about things like marriage and parenting. Marxist theory, which was sort of occupied the status of the outsider within sociology for many of those decades, was kind of a focus on the darker side of functionalism. And functionalism was kind of optimistic. Things are going well. Everybody plays their part, and societies run smoothly. We're all in agreement. Marxist theory said, no, that's actually not how it works. Marxist theory draws attention to the conflicts amongst groups within societies and amongst individuals within groups, although they weren't really that keen on talking about individuals. So when a Marxist sociologist looked at a family, what they saw was not this site of preparation so people could be good workers and devout churchgoers and do well in school and so forth. They saw families as the place or the site where workers are reproduced so that the ruling class, which owns the businesses and the factories and the farms and everything, can exploit them. Marxist theory holds that families actually do the work of capitalists for them, because families, in particular women, through their unpaid labor within the family, they create these workers and they make sure that the workers are available to capitalist enterprises as they are needed, and they absorb a lot of the negative outcomes of exploitation, in the form of illness, poor mental and physical health, old age, and so on. So families are like the shock absorbers for capitalism in Marxist theory, and they're also the source of an unending supply of labor for capitalist enterprises. Marxists also would argue that families are a sort of conveyor belt down through the generations. They're a way of ensuring that private property moves from one generation to the next. So when the father dies, he leaves everything to his son, and the son inherits, and private property gets moved down the generations. The relationship between families and private ownership of property was a big preoccupation of Marxist theorists. And some of them would argue that the reason there is an entity that we know as the family is because that's the way that control over resources was legitimated and was made acceptable and palatable to the society as a whole. And finally, Marxist theory would also argue that families, particularly things along the lines of the SNAF or other manifestations of patriarchal families, what they do is they legitimate men's control over women and children. The notion that a man is the king of his castle, a man is the head of the household. For a Marxist theorist, what that is not just role specialization, like a functionalist would say, or just the way things are, completely natural. They would say that's an ideological legitimation of male control over women, including women's sexuality and reproduction, and also over children, including the labor power of children. So families are all about control, exploitation, and power when you take a Marxist view of things. Responsibility. Functionalists and Marxists, although they disagreed on just about everything, had in common that they were taking picture view of families. How do families fit into this much larger web of social relations and connections and big social institutions. Symbolic interactionists changed their focus. They went micro with a good infusion of psychology into their work, starting in mid 1960s or so. And they were really interested in families as a site of one-to-one interactions, direct communication, whether that's verbal or nonverbal, interchanges amongst members. That's what symbolic interactionists said a family consists of. And you hear echoes of this in the process definition of family that we talked about earlier. So, as the name suggests, symbolic interactionists understood that communication between people, exchanges of information within a family always have a symbolic as well as a direct or literal meaning. So, for example, when, let's say, the oldest teenager in a family says, Mom, can I borrow the car? And mom says, okay, and tosses the keys to a teenage child. If you're looking at that only literally, it's a way of managing the teenage child's transportation issue. They've now got the use of a car. But a symbolic interactionist would look at that and say, no, there's a lot more family stuff, family processes going on there. There's the acknowledgement of the parent as the gatekeeper for the family resources. You know, you ask mom if you can borrow the car. You don't just go take the keys out of mom's bag and, take off on the car. There's the recognition of changes in the status of children as they grow up, the autonomy of the teenage child who wants to go off somewhere on their own. Mom giving them the keys is recognizing and is also fostering their autonomy. You wouldn't let like the 8-year-old go drive the car because they felt like it. So there's lots going on within families, and symbolic interactionists said that's what we need to study, the symbolic as well as the literal meanings of what people do in families. These two, and they have responsibility. Then in the early and mid 1970s, feminist theory came along and upended everything that had gone before it. The nature of this upending was the discovery of gender as something that's not just reducible to sex roles. There's the man's role and the woman's role, the husband and the wife, mother and father, and then you've got random kids who have their roles to play as well. Feminists began to explore how gender is enacted, changed, challenged, transformed, played out within families. They understood that gender is a lot more complex and context dependent and fluid than just a question of, who's the father, who's the mother, and are they behaving in the ways that a father or a mother ought to behave. And so they transcended the notion of sex roles, and they made the study of gender kind of front and center in the study of families within sociology. One of the big contributions of feminist sociologists when it comes to gender is looking at power and the claim that gender is not power neutral. Some individuals, by virtue of their gender, are able to exert more power than others within families. This could be decision-making power. This could be the power to have outcomes of situations kind of go the way they want the outcomes to go, the power to resolve conflicts in their own favor. Could be very subtle forms of power. It could be power that's negotiated or compromised or given up, but it's always there, and power and gender are sort of intrinsically bound together within families. Abilities. One particularly strong concern within feminist family sociology, and we'll be talking about this more as weeks go by, is the division of labor within families. What the work that goes on in families is often invisible. It's not as obvious as somebody who's in a factory or somebody who's working in an office, but it's nonetheless essential. It's unpaid. That's the main reason that it's invisible. And feminists have done a lot to sort of de-invisibilize the work of caring within families. And what they look for, what they study, is how these tasks are allocated, who is responsible for doing what, who gets credit for doing what, what are the consequences of the way that care, the labor involved in caring, is distributed within families, and where does gender fit in? How do ideas about gender or gender relations shape the distribution of the unpaid work that goes on within families, and usually but not always inside the home? And finally, bringing us up more or less to the present in family sociology is the postmodern era. Postmodernism is a huge topic, and there's endless debate about what it is or it isn't. As it applies to family sociology, however, this postmodern era has a few characteristics of family scholarship and teaching within sociology that previous eras didn't really do as much of. One is the idea that families are constantly evolving. They're constantly changing. Even as we study families, they are always in the midst of becoming different from the way that we assume they are, the way they think that we think they are. So this emphasis on constant change, you might even say instability or precariousness of families, and the constant sort of morphing of family forms and structures and behaviors is one way that postmodernism has influenced family sociology. Postmodernism would argue that there is no such thing as an ideal family form. There is nothing which represents this is the way that families ought to be or ought to function. There is no ideal. All we have is sort of endless versions of different ways of being a family. So postmodernism would really argue against the normative assumptions of things like the SNAF. This is what a good family looks like. Postmodern scholars also emphasize the relationship between individual agency and decision making and the contexts within which these decisions are made. So postmodernists would say, yeah, individuals within families have some freedom of choice. People decide how they're going to conduct themselves, how they're going to carry out their lives, but these choices are always constrained by forces that we may not even be aware of, forces like the values or the priorities of the society around us, forces that structure our world, our understanding of what is or is not possible for us. So this emphasis on individual action that is never eliminated but always constrained by other social forces is something which postmodern thought has brought to sociology. And that is what we've got for today.